I also want to start by acknowledging country. I'm coming in from the lands of the Wurundjeri peoples of the Kulin Nation and pay respects to their elders past and present, and also really want to pay tribute, given the context of this presentation, to the strength and resilience of the First Nations peoples that I've had the privilege of walking beside in their fight for justice for their families who've passed in custody, and for all the First Nations peoples who have, since the time of colonisation, resisted against the violence of colonial legal systems. In this presentation, I'm going to be speaking about the passing of Veronica Marie Nelson. I'll also reference her family and some other Aboriginal people who've passed. And I just want to give a warning, and I probably should have done so before the presentation, that this presentation does include the names and images of Aboriginal people who have passed on. I want to foreground this so today I'll speak a little bit about Veronica Nelson. I'll speak a little bit about the coronial inquest into her passing. Speak about the model of prison healthcare, particularly in Victoria, and the model and how it played out in Veronica's inquest in terms of a punitive model of healthcare. I'll speak about some issues with private prison healthcare, and their impacts on accountability and justice, and some calls for systemic change, and hopefully leave a good amount of time at the end for some questions as well. But feel free throughout the presentation, if you have a question or want clarification on a point and you don't want to wait till the end, feel free to put your hand up. I'm happy to stop and start and to keep it as casual as you want. So I just want to foreground this presentation with a little bit about Auntie Veronica Marie Nelson, whose story many of you would probably already be familiar with. I acted for Uncle Percy Lovett, Veronica's partner of 2 decades, in the coronial inquest into her passing, and then continued to act for him subsequently in fighting for justice for Veronica. And I also represented a number of other people in prison and families who had prematurely lost their loved ones. Veronica Nelson was described by all of her family and during the inquest as someone who was deeply spiritual. She was a proud Gunditjmara, Jaja Warang, Wiradjuri and Yorta Yorta woman. She loved AC/DC, was clever, would speak her mind, had a big personality and a beautiful laugh. She's dearly missed by her friends and family and community, particularly her mother, Auntie Donna Nelson. In Veronica's own words, which she wrote on a piece of paper that was given to the court a few days before her passing, she said, "My mother has always been like my father, someone who knows the song in my heart, and they've always been the ones to sing it back to me when I've forgotten the words." And I describe Veronica and who she was because I think it's really important. Too often, we read coronial inquests and about prison healthcare, which dehumanise and erase the stories of Aboriginal people who have died in custody. Veronica was only 36 years old when she died on the 2nd of January 2021, alone and in pain on the floor of a prison cell, at 2019, in what was ultimately found to be an entirely preventable death caused by the failure to provide her with adequate healthcare during her time in prison. In November last year, Veronica's partner, Uncle Percy Lovett, passed away. So I also just wanted to take a moment to pay tribute to all that he did for Veronica. Uncle Percy didn't have to take up the fight for her. He was someone who had been in and out of the prison system for much of his life, spent 2 decades with Veronica, and was deeply traumatized by her passing. But he attended every single day of the 6-week coronial inquest into her passing. And every time I saw him, he asked, "Do you think I'm doing the right thing?" and reiterated that he wanted to do it for all the other women who were inside. The inquest into Veronica's passing, a coronial inquest, initially wasn't considered to be a mandatory coronial inquest, because the forensic report, her autopsy report, stated that she died from a very rare gastrointestinal illness called Wilkie syndrome, and her cause of death was stated to be natural causes. Ultimately, that cause of death changed from Wilkie syndrome to also to foreground the fact that she died of opiate withdrawal and malnutrition in the setting of Wilkie syndrome. Because her cause of death was deemed to be natural causes, an inquest wasn't mandatory, and it was something that the family had to push for. At the time when I started acting for Uncle Percy, the story that we had been told about Veronica's passing was that although tragic, she died from a rare illness that could not have been prevented, that all of the nurses and doctors did all that they could to prevent her passing, and that the prison healthcare providers and the corrective services acted appropriately and were, in some reports, even thanked for the level of assistance that they provided to Veronica. And so that was the context where we came into the inquest. And right from the beginning, when I started to act for Uncle Percy and, speaking to other people who were with her in prison and her family and her friends and loved ones believed that there had been a cover-up into her passing, didn't believe the story that she had died from natural causes, didn't believe that her death was not preventable, and also believed that she died from opiate withdrawal, something that she had come into custody with, and that they had seen and had personal experience with. But that wasn't the story that we were presented with at the beginning, although it was ultimately the story that came out. I'll just speak a little bit about the story of what happened to Veronica in custody, because I think it's really telling and showcases some of the many systemic failures within the prison healthcare system. And I also want to foreground this by saying that although Veronica died in the most horrific of circumstances, in my experience working at the Victorian Aboriginal Legal Service, I would not say that Veronica's circumstances were unique. I have represented many clients who have been treated in similar ways to the way that Veronica Nelson was treated in custody. And they, in many cases, suffered near misses, which could have led to their deaths. I think the reason why we know so much about how Veronica died is because her death was recorded by CCTV footage, and we have intercom calls of her begging for help. And ultimately, in the coronial inquest into her death, although not initially, ultimately, there were critical witnesses and whistleblowers who came forward who provided evidence that was contrary to that initial evidence that we were presented with. And so throughout the 6-week coronial inquest, I think we were able to get a fairly good sense of the truth of what happened to Veronica Nelson. But there are so many other cases where we speak to clients and they are not able to prove what happened to them, but they tell similar stories. And I just want to say that because I think there is this temptation in the way that Veronica's story was presented to the media was as this complete aberration. And I don't think it is so. And I think her story actually shows that it is not just a one-off aberration. So Veronica entered the Dame Phyllis Frost Centre on the 31st of December. 3 days later, when she passed away, she weighed 33 kilograms. That is, as I'm sure many of you know, severely underweight, and a point of critical weight loss that should be immediately seen by emergency care. When she entered prison, she was withdrawing from opiates. She was assessed by a doctor and a nurse, the Dr. Sean Runnikers and registered nurse Stephanie Hills. Registered nurse Stephanie Hills, her witness statement only came before the inquest 2 weeks before it started, and she was one of the whistleblowers in the inquest. She gave completely contradictory evidence to that of the initial Dr. Sean Runnikers, and ultimately the coroner preferred her evidence in the inquest. She stated that during the medical examination of Veronica at her intake health assessment, that Dr. Runnikers did not conduct any physical examination of Veronica, that he remained in his chair for the entirety of the medical assessment. She said that Veronica was extremely unwell during the medical assessment, but was unable to sit upright, unable to walk to the scale, was fading in and out of consciousness. She said that she told Dr. Runnikers that Veronica needed to go to hospital, but Dr. Runnikers dismissed this. The coroner ultimately found that Dr. Veronica's notes contained a number of serious inaccuracies, including that Veronica's weight was 40.7 kilograms. And the medical experts found that it simply would not have been possible for Veronica to have lost 7 kilos in the couple of days before she passed away. The coroner found that he failed to physically examine Veronica, plan for her ongoing care, and maintain medical records. And experts found that from the moment that Veronica entered custody, given the symptoms that she was exhibiting, she should have been sent immediately to hospital. But it wasn't just Dr. Runnikers who failed to provide Veronica with adequate care. It wasn't simply a matter of one bad apple. During the 3 days that Veronica was in custody, her painfully polite requests for help over the intercom were repeatedly ignored. She called for help at least 49 times. She saw a number of other medical staff in her time in custody, including a doctor and nurse the subsequent day, who understood that she had been experiencing vomiting and nausea and was unable to hold down her food. She repeatedly called for help to non-medically trained guards, who often didn't pass on her calls for help to medically trained staff. She was provided with medical advice from those guards. She was recommended salt, and she was also repeatedly told to stop pressing the intercom buzzer, that it was for emergencies only. On her final day that she was alive, after she had reported severe cramps, pain, and vomiting, she was told that there was nothing much that could be done for her by the prison officer on duty. That prison officer ultimately did call a registered nurse who came to visit her on her last night before she passed away. That nurse saw her only through the trap door. Veronica was not clothed, and that nurse had to prise open her hand to give her pain relief. And Veronica repeatedly screamed and cried out for help after that. And she was told to stop, that she was keeping the other prisoners awake. The other women in prison also tried to call out for help for her, whilst they remained locked in their cells, unable to help her. We don't know her exact time of death, but there is a moment, but her shower was running, and there was a moment on the intercom where there appears to have been heard a thud at some time in the early morning. Veronica ultimately passed away from malnutrition caused by opiate withdrawal with an underlying gastrointestinal illness, Wilkie syndrome, that meant that she was less able to intake food. The coroner found, and that all the medical experts agreed in the inquest, that her death was entirely preventable, that she needed to go to hospital from the moment she entered prison, and that her life could have been saved by something as simple as an intravenous drip. I think as one of the experts who gave evidence in this inquest, Professor Megan Williams, said, Veronica was someone who actively asked for help. She did everything that she could to seek help for herself, but she was repeatedly ignored. And in my view, and in the view of the coroner, the fact that her cries for help were not just ignored by one medical officer or one prison healthcare officer, one corrections facility staff, but ignored by multiple and dozens of these staff, I think shows a really systemic problem within the prison healthcare system. So in prison healthcare, and please, I'm really sorry that I'm probably repeating information that many of you would already know. But as you would know, the prison health environment by its very nature is one which can generate illness and ill health. And yet at the same time, people in prison like Veronica are not free to access healthcare when they need it. They can't call a doctor, they can't call emergency, and except for in the ACT, First Nations people can't access Aboriginal community-controlled health services that provide healthcare that meets their social, emotional, and cultural needs. Rather, in their prison cells, as was made so clear in Veronica's inquest, their only lifeline is an intercom that connects them to a non-medically trained prison guard. And that guard then has the power to decide whether to relay critical health information to medical practitioners. That intercom is a lifeline. It's the point at which the prison cell connects to the outside world. And by cutting off that connection and cutting off that ignoring cries for help, prison guards can reenact this punitive logic of the prison, which cuts people off from their communities and any form of healthcare. And I would argue that this system, in and of itself, is antithetical to healthcare, which in all cultures and settings is to be timely, non-discriminatory, respectful, safe, confidential, and collaborative. I think all of those factors, it is extremely hard to meet them in the prison setting itself. I think Veronica's healthcare was punitive, and the coroner found that it was punitive in a number of respects. Auntie Vicky Roach gave evidence in Veronica's inquest. She's an Aboriginal elder who said that there is this underlying ideology throughout corrections that we should suffer, that we need to suffer to be corrected. And I would argue that this punitive logic pervaded the healthcare that Veronica received in custody. The coroner found that there was a punitive approach to the provision of pharmacotherapy to Veronica, whereby people in prison like Veronica, who were only entering prison for a short period of time, were, by virtue of justice health policies that existed at the time, unable to access opioid replacement therapy. So, and they would only be able to access this opioid replacement therapy if they were in custody for over 6 weeks. And this meant that people like Veronica and many other people who were only in prison for short periods of time could not access this therapy, and instead, if they were withdrawing from opiates, forced to undergo what was described to the inquest as very painful withdrawal. I think also the other really important punitive aspect of the healthcare that Veronica was provided was the way in which her cries for help were ignored and neglected and not believed. This is not something that's unique to Veronica. Countless coronial inquests into First Nations deaths in custody document refusals or reluctance to provide basic medical treatment and care. In 2017, Camilla man Eric Whitaker passed away from a ruptured cerebral artery aneurysm after guards dismissed his 20 calls for help over the cell's intercom. In 2018, 36-year-old Aboriginal man Nathan Reynolds passed away after prison staff failed to treat a severe asthma attack as an emergency, and the response that he received was delayed. In 2014, 22-year-old Yamatji woman Miss Du died in police custody in Western Australia from a broken rib and a severe case of pneumonia. And during her time in detention, police and medical staff dismissed her cries for help and said that she was faking her injuries or exaggerating. This, in my view, can relate to a number of different factors. First, one being the stigma that all incarcerated peoples experience in custody, and I think pervades the custodial system and the prison healthcare system, but also stigma against drug users and racism within the prison healthcare system, both on an individual and a systemic level. In Veronica's inquest, Dr. Amanda Porter provided expert evidence saying that the barriers that Aboriginal women in prison face when accessing healthcare include institutional racism and discrimination in the form of not being listened to, stereotyping, and inequitable healthcare. Another expert witness in the inquest, Professor Carla Trelaw, told the inquest that racist stereotypes are compounded by stigma against drug users. One of the women who was in prison with Veronica, Kylie Baston, who tried to help Veronica, told the inquest that the stigma experienced by about this stigma, and she said, "We're looked upon as scum and they treat us just as junkies." We argued in the inquest on behalf of Uncle Percy Lovett that both racism and stigma against drug users, which both have deep roots in Australia's criminal system, explain why Veronica's repeated cries for help went unanswered. In Veronica's inquest, the prison guards estimated that 50 to 90% of women entering prison were withdrawing, but despite this, specialist care for withdrawal was lacking. And although Veronica asked to be treated with methadone, this request was denied. While the coroner didn't make findings as to racism, there is evidence that we presented to the inquest and that is on the screen now. We presented evidence from a Guardian investigation that found that whilst the most common cause of death for all people in custody is medical issues, First Nations people who die in custody are 3 times more likely to not receive all required medical care prior to their passing. And for First Nations women, the result is even worse. Less than half receive required medical care prior to their death. The coroner's findings in Veronica's inquest were that Veronica wasn't provided with equivalent care, and that this failing causally contributed to her death, that there was this failure to convey information between Corrections Victoria and healthcare staff, including about Veronica vomiting, including about her buzzing up. And the coroner found that corrections staff obstructed the provision of healthcare to Veronica, and that this causally contributed to her passing. The coroner found that there were significant gaps in information sharing and policies and procedures, and a lack of communication, and also a real breakdown of relationship between corrections and justice health and healthcare staff. And I would say from witnessing the evidence, that was the lack of trust between corrections staff and healthcare staff was really palpable throughout the inquest, to the extent that some nurses, the nurse who was provided Veronica with healthcare on her final night and had to prise open her hands and only viewed her through the trap, said that she was too scared to ask the prison officers to open the door for Veronica. She couldn't explain why she was scared of the prison officers, but she articulated that fear. The prison officers likewise said that they didn't trust medical staff to be able to provide appropriate medical care. And I would say that this lack of trust between correction staff and prison healthcare staff is something that I've seen repeated throughout multiple coronial inquests, and is also something that appears to be, to me, I would say, to be a systemic issue, in that we repeatedly see throughout coronial inquests this attempts to shift blame between corrections and healthcare staff, rather than a system of working together. And I think that that has a lot to do with the fact that corrections are sort of the gatekeepers of healthcare, and there is this sort of power dynamic between them, and the healthcare staff are really sort of at the mercy of the broader general prison system when they are providing healthcare within prison. I think that there are many different facets of prison healthcare that mean that it is kept separate from the healthcare that is provided within the general community. And some of these barriers are probably barriers that can be overcome by system changes, but I think some of these barriers are structural. And I think these include both its governance, culture, and lack of accountability. So in prisons, healthcare providers often speak about this conflict between their duty to preserve patient health and well-being and their obligation to follow prison policies and rules that exist to manage, surveil people in prison. As you would well know, in prisons, there's no Medicare or pharmaceutical benefit scheme. Prison policies can restrict access to prescription medications that are otherwise available in the public system. And even where these prison policies don't prevent access to medications that are available in the public system, in my experience, and this has been evidence that's been provided in other coronial inquests, there seems to be in some prisons a culture of, we are not allowed to request this particular type of medication, or this is the opioid withdrawal pack that we provide. Yes, we could provide methadone, but it's just simply not something that is done within this prison setting. It's very unclear whether this relates to financial implications, because obviously without the Medicare or the PBS, it means the way that prison healthcare is funded is that there is this sum of money that is provided to prison healthcare providers to provide healthcare services in prison, and then prison healthcare providers have to determine how they dish out that money. That could mean that people in prison are provided with a higher quality of healthcare. But I think what I have seen throughout representing numerous families is that there appears to be cost incentive that come into play when it comes to prison healthcare and providing certain types of medication. And then there's this secondary issue that is in Victoria, where, and in some other states, so in many states, including Victoria and Western Australia, prison healthcare is managed by justice departments rather than health departments. And I think that that further reinforces this prison logic, and it also conflicts with advice from the World Health Organization and the United Nations, which emphasizes that prison healthcare should be part of a country's general health services. In Victoria, prison healthcare in public prisons is outsourced to for-profit private prison providers who frequently change their corporate structures. At the time of Veronica's passing, a corporation called Correct Care Australasia provided healthcare at Victoria's public and youth prisons. After Veronica's passing, that contract went to GEO Group Australasia, who is the former parent company of Correct Care Australasia. Following years of advocacy, in July 2022, we did have a win in that prison healthcare in Victoria's women's prisons was transferred to public providers, but healthcare in the men's public prisons remains in private hands. And it's not just Victoria that relies on for-profit prison healthcare. Australia has the highest rate of private incarceration in the world, even higher than the United States. And companies like Serco, G4S, GEO Group rake in over 600 million per year within these private prison contracts. And in private prisons, prison healthcare is then managed and provided by the same private prison healthcare providers that are responsible for managing the prison system itself. To me, I think that there are a number of issues with private prison healthcare. The first being the profit motive, which I think contradicts the model of providing holistic healthcare. And second, I would say that that profit motive can lead to a system of cover-ups. And this was made evident in Veronica's inquest. So I guess it may seem obvious to most people that a corporation with its core purpose of making profits rather than healing patients is going to provide worse quality care. And that's why now in many states in the United States, including New York and Massachusetts, they don't allow for-profit hospitals or healthcare. Studies have consistently shown that prisons with private healthcare providers have higher numbers of deaths in custody. And that's not to say that public healthcare providers always provide high quality care. I think that many don't. And I think that the prison system itself, as I said, can often generate ill health, and that prison healthcare itself faces structural issues in providing actual quality healthcare to people. But I would say that the prioritization of profits over patient healthcare means that corporations are incentivized to increase profits, cut costs, expand to new settings, and protect their multi-million dollar contracts. And this has been borne out in the United States, where there's been a lot of research into private prison healthcare providers, particularly the parent company of Correct Care Australasia, who is WellPath. Internal documents have shown of WellPath that there is also this system of promoting profit and covering up passings in custody. In Veronica's inquest, this system of cover-ups, I guess, was laid bare because we really found out exactly what had occurred. So as I said previously, her death was she was deemed to have passed from natural causes. A coronial inquest was not mandatory. There were 2 reviews into her death that they were firstly the JARO review and secondly the Justice Health Death in Custody report, as well as a root cause analysis by Correct Care Australasia. None of these reviews found that there was any failing to provide Veronica with adequate health care. And the coroner found that that these reviews were grossly inadequate, and that there was a system of cover-up which led to Veronica's passing. So these reviews, which conducted debriefs with relevant staff, they found that there was not much that could be improved. They found that the prison healthcare providers and the corrections staff did all that they could, and in one case even congratulated the staff. The coroner found that these debriefs and reviews did not critically examine the incident. There was an appalling lack of disclosure between Correct Care Australasia and Justice Health, in that Correct Care Australasia failed to provide critical information to Justice Health. And at the inquest, so what ultimately ended up happening at the inquest was that one nurse, as I mentioned, Stephanie Hills, she came, despite having been interviewed by Correct Care Australasia following Veronica's death by an employee of Correct Care Australasia, there was a decision made by Correct Care executives not to take a statement from her. And so when the coroner asked Correct Care Australasia to provide them with statements of all of the healthcare providers who Veronica had seen, her statement was not provided to the court. And this was in the original coronial inquest brief. The only reason we know that these executives made this recommendation or said that this statement should not have been taken was that during the course of the inquest itself, because of media reporting, a senior executive from Correct Care Australasia came forward to the court and asked to provide evidence. His name was Jeremy Limpens, and he was a staff member who had been tasked with interviewing relevant staff after Veronica's passing. He asked the court to be relieved of a contractual provision, preventing him from speaking about his employment at Correct Care Australasia. And he provided evidence to the inquest about those statements that he had been taken and about that directive that he had been given not to take a statement from Nurse Hills. And so that's how we found out about and you might imagine that if Veronica's case hadn't gone to an inquest, if it hadn't received the media coverage, I don't believe that we would have received this evidence from this senior executive. I think that there are uniquely perverse incentives created by the privatisation of prison healthcare, which can lead to this culture of cover-ups. Obviously, I think it is human nature, and I've seen throughout many different coronial inquests into, not even in regard to deaths in custody, but police deaths, it's human nature to want to cover up passings in custody. But when it comes to private prison healthcare providers, there is a risk that they lose their multi-million-dollar contracts. So Correct Care Australasia had $700 million worth of contracts with the Victorian government. And ultimately, because of this inquest, they lost those contracts. Those contracts were not renewed. And so you can see why corporations might be incentivized not to provide critical evidence to coronial inquests, and not to provide critical evidence that can enable these systems, through reports that happen after a passing in custody, to improve themselves, and to actually be able to, improve systems so that the deaths in custody don't occur. I would also argue that there is a potential for this private prison healthcare motive as well to not just cover up deaths in custody, but to cover up all manner of ill treatment and complaints made by people in custody, because those complaints then are reported to Justice Health, and they are not necessarily they are taken as part of they're assessed by Justice Health as part of the the healthcare providers' performance of their contractual obligations. There was also, I would say, and this has come out in other inquests, and I'm going to stop soon because I want to give you time to answer questions. But I think there is as well, it's not just that there was this cover up on behalf of Correct Care Australasia, but there's also this, I think, lack of real scrutiny that was revealed by Justice Health itself in Veronica's inquest. And we know from Veronica's inquest, but also other inquests, that the very metrics upon which prison healthcare providers are assessed often can focus on the quantity of healthcare services provided, and insurance, that particular forms are filled out, and that people, see particular doctors, and a lack of emphasis on the quality of healthcare and healthcare outcomes itself. And I think that that can also lead to a system that doesn't actually properly hold itself accountable. I think just, finally, there is often, and what we've seen throughout many coronial inquests, real impunity for neglect. And I think that this fuels this culture of, and this failure to provide adequate healthcare in prison. There's often very little that can be done to hold bad actors to account. And whilst coronial inquests like Veronica's inquest the coroner did make significant findings in regard to failures to provide adequate healthcare. Ultimately, the coroner referred multiple medical practitioners to AHPRA. The coroner made referrals to the DPP and a number of other referrals, and none of those referrals ended up leading to any form of disciplinary action against any of the healthcare providers or against the private prison healthcare system. And I think, as stated by Dr. Amanda Porter in Veronica's inquest, if we're asking why deaths in custody continue to occur, it is because of hollow words and hollow promises, including a culture of denial, not hearing, and of impunity. And this is really part of the problem. And just, I know I said finally, but just finally, actually finally, in terms of where to from here, I think that, in my view, one of the really important things that we can be doing is trying to connect prison healthcare to the healthcare that is provided in the community. There are incorporating prison healthcare systems within public healthcare systems is not only something that is recommended by the World Health Organization, the United Nations, but it also means that people within prisons can access Medicare services, PBS medications, can access their community healthcare providers. It means that notes can more easily be shared across prison healthcare systems and community healthcare systems, and also having medical staff that work across prison healthcare systems and public healthcare systems, I think also means that those staff are less likely to feel this sense of constraint by their work environment and by the prison healthcare environment. And then also central to having a safe healthcare system for First Nations people is that healthcare be culturally safe, which means having access to Aboriginal community-controlled health organisations. I think that those steps would go a long way towards enabling healthcare in prisons to be independent of the correctional system. And ultimately, there does need to be real accountability for deaths in custody and medical neglect. And so I'll just end with Uncle Percy Lovett's words. He said, "I want everyone to remember what happened to Veronica and to change. No one should have to die in prison. No one should die in pain. No one should die alone in a prison cell." I'll just stop presenting and leave, just 15 minutes for any questions or comments. But yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Really great presentation and really, really moving as well. I always find that thought quite scary, where you've just got an intercom is your only sort of, lifeline to healthcare, and it's not often or not ever manned by a healthcare professional. So yeah, I've always found that thought very scary, where you've essentially got no power. I'll open it up to questions now. If anyone wants to put their hand up. Yeah, Stuart.
Sarah, I'm sorry I missed the beginning of your presentation, but thank you so much for coming along and sharing this. And I just want to add my respects, I'm sure, what everyone else did at the beginning of this to Veronica Nelson and her family. And it's such a tragic and painful thing to talk about, but I really respect that you're coming along and sharing this. My kind of question is just perhaps just an invitation for you to reflect. My principled position is precisely what you're articulating about the independence of healthcare. I suppose, and I don't think I want to qualify that, but I want to add to it by saying that my experience in our group recently, for example, was commissioned by Danila Dilba to do a review of their service, which, as I'm sure you know, is ending in Dondale in a month. And it's made me really cognizant of the fact that having healthcare delivered by health, as the WHO recommends, is kind of necessary but not sufficient. And there's a ton of other things that we need to do to realise the benefits that will create. I'm just wondering if you can reflect from your expertise and experience what some of those other key things might be.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think that's totally right. Like it's not just about that independence or health providing healthcare. I think that there is this, I think the idea of equivalence, and I think others have written about this as well, that equivalence of care doesn't mean giving the exact same amount of money and services to people in prison, because we are dealing with a setting that is generative of ill health. And I think that really needs to be recognised. Like, it's not simply a matter, I think, of providing people in prison with their 10 sessions with a psychologist, although of course we know that people in Victoria are not provided with access to a psychologist, and this was made clear in Heather Calgarett's inquest, which was still waiting for findings, but she was someone whose mental health deteriorated to a severe extent in custody over the course of years, and she's provided access to psychiatrists who can prescribe medication, but not psychologists. And I would say that we need to acknowledge the fact that prison healthcare is, the harms caused by the prison system itself, and the healthcare that is provided needs to actually meet that level of harm that is provided, that is occurring within the prison system itself. I think some of that is funding. There does seem to me to be, despite, even for the women's prisons in Victoria, and we know because they've been transferred back to public healthcare providers, but still it's this sort of contractual model, which I'm not sure exactly, you probably know best how it exists in other states, but I think that contractual model is a real problem. So still the way that it operates in Victoria is that the Justice Health puts out a tender, and these public providers have now answered the tender, but it's still that they're being provided with this sort of lump sum of money to provide the healthcare, which I think doesn't actually, and so they still have these constraints of saying we can't actually afford to have psychologists, we can't actually afford to have obesity specialists, we can't actually afford to have these like specialist trauma, trauma providers within prison healthcare, despite the fact that 80% of women in prison have suffered sexual violence. We don't provide these services in prison. So I think that there is an extent to which there is, that we need to be tracking sort of the ways that specific cohorts of people that are in prison and having a healthcare system that is designed to meet their needs. But I think some of the problems, like, probably just can't be answered within the carceral setting. Like, I think if you have an intercom that is your gateway to accessing healthcare, immediately you're not going to be able to have access to equal healthcare. And the experience of Danila Dilba, I think my understanding was that it was extremely, my understanding from them, and I think they've spoken about this publicly, is that it was extremely hard for them to provide healthcare in prison, and many of the healthcare staff felt like they were really compromised. Like, there are staff that want to provide good healthcare in prisons, but then they go into the prison setting and they immediately have to face the fact that everything is incredibly punitive, that they can't, just provide they can't see their patients whenever they want to. They have to get approval to enter doors. They have to, have these long lists where they have like 20 people on the list and they can only see everyone for 5 minutes. They have to meet these metrics that Justice Health provide them with, where they have to see like a certain amount of patients per day. And so I think all these things are sort of set up so that there's these great ticker box. And I mean, I think Heather Calgarett's inquest was really evidence of that, in that she saw in her few years in prison, like, I think it would have been the equivalent of like a doctor every 2 days or something like that, which is like an incredible like quantity of medical care. But the quality of medical care was that none of those doctors actually provided her with any healthcare advice and treatment. They were just monitoring her. So they're just like, weight monitoring her, testing her glucose levels, and then they're just watching her deteriorate and deteriorate. But no one actually, and I don't think that it's any of the individual healthcare providers' faults. And that's, I think, what I wanted to accentuate about Veronica's inquest. I don't think it's any of these individual doctors or nurses who are like really bad actors. I think people are often going into these settings wanting to help, but they are so constrained by the system itself. And so, I think having that level of independence, having a prison healthcare system that is really given free rein. But yeah, so much of that butts up with the very prison system itself.
Thanks. Cameron?
Yeah, thanks so much, Sarah. Just on that last point, I was wondering whether the Wilkes syndrome was actually passed on as a medical record to the doctor, and if so, whether he specified or she specified hydration. That was the first thing, just a side point, but I wanted to ask also about the coroner's reports.
So the Wilkes syndrome is actually, this case is very unique in that there are only 2 cases. So Veronica was only diagnosed with Wilkes syndrome post-mortem. My understanding from the inquest was that there's only been 2 cases of post-mortem findings of Wilkes syndrome, and both were by the same pathologist, who was the pathologist who examined Veronica. And so that there are some questions about that, and there were some questions raised in the inquest about whether that should have been diagnosed post-mortem. And this is my very non-medically trained understanding, is that for Veronica, and at least this was the evidence that was provided by an expert gastroenterologist, although she may have had Wilkes syndrome, which is that sort of narrowing of, I'm actually not going to be able to describe it because it's been a few years, but because she had lost so much weight, it meant that that combined with her Wilkes syndrome meant that she wasn't able to take in food, and she was vomiting up all of her food and suffering from severe dehydration and malnutrition. I think it's unclear whether I think ultimately the pathologist found that the opiate withdrawal was the predominant cause of death, and that Wilkes syndrome was the setting in which the passing occurred. But yeah, there wasn't that. There was no assessment of her weight or her nutrition or her hydration or anything like that. So there was no, and there was no passing on of her previous medical history, but none of her previous medical history documented Wilkes syndrome either.
Right. And just with the coroner's reports, you're probably in a good position to talk about how accurate the reports are in terms of you're providing submissions, and I've always just presumed that it's adequately reported in the coroner's report. But are you frustrated or satisfied with how much actually makes it into the report?
Yes, I think that the short answer is yes. Look, in Veronica's inquest, the coroner, I think, did an amazing job and actually really thoroughly examined her death, and the family was pleased with the findings that he made into her death. There were still many aspects, like the full scale of the cover-up was not documented in the findings. There were many things that the coroner couldn't get to. But I think in my experience, having appeared in probably a dozen inquests now, is that there's a huge variation between coroners. And some coroners will be willing to examine systemic issues. Some coroners will be less likely. And as I said, the coroner changed in Veronica's inquest because of sort of a conflict of interest which arose. And that initial, I think there is a world in which, and like a very believable world in which Veronica's, we didn't receive that evidence from Nurse Hills. We didn't receive the evidence from the correct care executive who ended up being a whistleblower. Veronica's inquest was listed for 2 days, and there wasn't, all this number of medical experts who occurred, and her death was found to be caused by Wilkes syndrome, which could never have been prevented. So I think that is that could have been a possibility, and I think that there are other coronial inquests where families are incredibly frustrated at coroners making those sorts of findings. Coroners are not perfect. I think that there has been a real shift, particularly in Victoria, to coroners examining more of those systemic factors that are leading to deaths, but there is also a massive pushback against that. So, in inquests, like in Veronica's inquest, there were 16 parties at the bar table, 2 of us representing family members and everyone else representing potential wrongdoers, and all of those parties have an interest in the coroner not examining the death to the extent that the family would like the coroner to examine the death. And coroners can come from a range of backgrounds. So yeah, there are definitely inquests where we felt frustrated that coroners haven't examined the death in the way that the family wants, and there's very little recourse for that.
Oh, thank you for your wonderful work anyway. Yeah.
Matt?
Cheers, Darcy, and thank you, Sarah, for an amazing presentation. I guess I've got two questions. I know a bit more about probably these processes in the UK, but the things that you're talking about resonate so profoundly. I'm not sure if you saw there was some recent work published by colleagues at Glasgow who analysed the FAIs in Scotland and so showed a significant increase in deaths in custody in police and prisons. It'd be really good to get your reflections on whether you see similar trends happening in Victoria and Australia more widely. And the second question is about just this process is clearly not fit for purpose and entirely inadequate. I remember sitting in on a couple of fatal accidents inquiries, as they're called, in Scotland, and it just resonated with what you said. On one side, you have essentially the most highly paid QCs that the state can get hold of, like really the top solicitors. And on the other side, you've got a family often really struggling with loads of other issues who are trying to get some legal representation. It's completely unfair, and it's extremely bureaucratic and really slow. I mean, quite often these inquiries take 3 or 4 years to kind of get to any sort of meaningful conclusion. And then, at least in my experience, the recommendations that are made are almost never put into practice. So then you just sit back and think, well, what is going on here? So do you know anywhere that's doing this better? Or is there anywhere where you look and go, actually, this looks like a promising approach, and actually the families are more central to what's happening, as opposed to it just continuing the pain that they're suffering?
That's a great question. I mean, I think that everything that you said is true of the Australian context as well. We are seeing an increase in deaths in custody and First Nations deaths in custody, but in Victoria, but also throughout the country. I think some of that relates to the increasing number of people in custody as well, which we're seeing now, particularly in Victoria. I mean, Victoria is now expanding its prison population, has just changed the bail laws back from what they were. They were changed after Veronica's inquest, because as some of you may know, she was arrested on minor shoplifting charges and refused bail. They were changed after that. Now they've changed back. There's going to be skyrocketing prison numbers. I expect that there will be more deaths in custody, and we see more deaths in custody. And yeah, these systems are not, I would agree, they're not fit for purpose. I mean, families are at a complete disadvantage. There is some Commonwealth funding for Aboriginal legal services to provide representation. That was after Veronica's inquest that came into play, but we're at a significant disadvantage. Where, community lawyers, like barristers, are often acting pro bono, or they are acting in Veronica's inquest, they're acting pro bono. It's a completely different ballgame. And the coroner's courts have tried to, they've done some things which are good. Like they've had, in Victoria, there's a Koori engagement unit who does really fantastic work in sort of engaging with the families and keeping them up to date and ensuring their needs are met. But at the same time, there's no funding for families to for accommodation and transport to Inquest. So often that was something that we had to fund as an organisation. And families don't often they don't live in the places where there is the coroner's court, and so we're asking people to take a month out of their lives to go to a coronial inquest. They've got work, they've got to take off work, and they're not provided any compensation for this, and often the process is incredibly grueling. And I mean, I guess at a personal level, it has really that sort of lack of accountability, that even when you get the findings, they aren't implemented. I mean, the coroner's recommendations in Veronica's inquest haven't been implemented, or many of them haven't been implemented. It can exacerbate families' grief and trauma. And there are certainly cases that I've appeared in where I have spoken to families about the fact that the coronial inquest system has not provided them with anything and has exacerbated their grief and trauma. And it would have been better if it hadn't occurred at all. I mean, that's not every family. A lot of families, I mean, most families want to pursue the system, but yeah, it can lead to really, so I mean, yeah, we need to see a profound change to, I think, the way that we investigate these sorts of deaths and give families a really central role. I'm not aware of any systems who are doing it better, but I would love to know if anyone else comes across them, because it is so important. And it's draining. I mean, I no longer work in this particular area. It is an extremely draining area to work in. And yeah, the grief and loss is huge.